Pleasure to welcome our final patient, last but not least speaker for the day, Professor Brian Walker. Brian was elected in 2013 and will present to us on the fascinating topic of evolution and resilience in the Anthropocene. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Well, good evening. I'm glad you've all survived. It's a great honor for me to be here today. I really am pleased, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging and thanking all the many colleagues who have actually made my work possible. And I'd also like to thank my family, and especially my wife Laura, for their absolutely necessary support. The citation for my fellowship says that contributions to the interdisciplinary area of resilience in complex adaptive systems, and it crossed many disciplines. And in the spirit of this cross-disciplinarity and a broad integration, I thought I'd like to take a bit of a risk and offer with some trepidation, but hopefully as a fitting finale to a day of completely fascinating science, a proposition for how the world might achieve long-term human well-being. And I'm going to try and do it by making 4 successive points. And the first one has to do with evolution. Now, almost everyone in this audience, I'm sure, will be familiar with Jacques Monod's book, Chance and Necessity, for which he got the Nobel Prize. And it's still probably one of the best accounts of how biological evolution works from the molecular level up. And Monod's message was that life is entirely accidental. And as this is a quote from there, that people really spend an awful amount of time trying to deny this, and that we really desperately deny our own contingency. It's a dismal message when you get down to thinking about it. And the negative responses to the message of evolution are 2, really, for those who can't handle it. They either deny it or they ignore it, just refuse to consider it. And that leads to 2 kinds of outcomes. The denialists either turn to religion, or they join with those who ignore it and turn to short-termism. Have a great time while we're all going to hell kind of thing. So go for growth would be the 2. And but in humans, evolution is not purely biological. It's both biological and social. And we need to consider both. Social evolution is the notion of ideas, of norms, of ethics, of memes. I don't want to get into a discussion of memes versus genes. I know there's some intricacies and people disagree with a lot, but it captures that idea because certainly social evolution exists. And the important thing about it is that it is lateral, and therefore it is very, very fast. And it includes, this is important as well, both random changes and mutations, if you want, as in biological, but also deliberate changes. And therein, this fast plus the deliberate, lies some hope. And I'll give as an example the evolution of ethics. And I'll just start with a little quote from Aldo Leopold's wonderful book, The Sand County Almanac, and his chapter from the land ethic. When godlike Odysseus returned from the wars in Troy, he hanged all on one rope 12 slave girls of his household, whom he suspected of misbehavior during his absence. This hanging involved no question of propriety. The girls were property. The disposal of property was then, as now, a matter of expediency, not of right and wrong. Concepts of right and wrong were not lacking from Odysseus's Greece. Witness the fidelity of his wife through the long years before at last his black-prowed galleys clove the wine-dark seas for home. The ethical structure of that day covered wives, but had not yet been extended to human chattels. During the 3,000 years which have since elapsed, ethical criteria have been extended to many fields of conduct, with corresponding shrinkages in those judged by expediency only. And then Leopold went on to say that there is as yet no ethic dealing with man's relation to land and to the animals and plants which grow upon it. Land, like Odysseus' slave girls, is still property. The land relation is still strictly economic, entailing privileges but not obligations. And he finishes with a great statement that nothing so important as an ethic is ever written. Only the most superficial student of history supposes that Moses wrote the Decalogue. It evolved in the minds of a thinking community. And Moses wrote a tentative summary of it for a seminar. And I say tentative because evolution never stops. Well, that notion of social evolution, including the evolution of ethics, brings us into the Anthropocene, because social evolution is now dominant, and it is now the main driver of the selection processes in biological evolution. The future is therefore being determined through an interconnected process of biological and social evolution. Which brings me to my point 2, building on that, to do with self-organization and resilience. Change in natural and social systems happens in 2 ways. It can either be driven by external forces, something makes it change, or without any change in the external environment, internally generate a change through self-organization, like the process of ecological succession in ecosystems, a classic case of self-organizing. And again, I think most of you in this audience will be familiar with Stuart Kauffman's book, At Home in the Universe. And in it, he argues that natural selection and self-organization are 2 complementary forces necessary for evolution. And he has this quote that we get to understand how to think about systems governed simultaneously by 2 sources of order. And that if we're ever going to attain a final theory in biology, we will surely have to understand this commingling of self-organization and selection. The thing about self-organizing systems is that there are limits to the self-organizing capacity of a system. And that leads to the existence of alternate stability domains. If you exceed that limit, you cross that threshold, and this is in physical, in biological, in ecological, and in social systems, the system begins to function differently. It doesn't return to the same attractor, it heads off on a different trajectory. Which brings us to the notion of resilience, which I define, or the Resilience Alliance defines, as the amount of change that a system can undergo and yet still retain the same structure, function, and feedbacks, and therefore have the same identity. And it's that with self-organization that I want to bring into my 3rd point, which is the trajectory that the world is on in the Anthropocene. And basically, the trajectory is a looming catastrophe in the face of the food, energy, water nexus. So as a social ecological system, the world is self-organizing along a really dangerous trajectory because it's aiming for impossible targets. Now, this wording, the food, energy, water nexus, isn't mine. It actually came out of a group of international companies that have become aware of this problem and are really concerned about what to do about it. And they formed a thing called the Resilience Action Initiative. It was initiated originally by the CEO of Shell, who realized he couldn't do it on his own, so he got his mates, who are the CEOs of Dow Chemical and IBM and Swiss Re and 9 other major global companies, to say the world can't keep doing what it's doing. If we keep along on this trajectory, we're all doomed. The systems in which our companies exist, for them to be resilient, the systems in which they're embedded have to be resilient, and it isn't. So we're all going to go under, and we have to do something about it. But what do we do? Well, they're grappling with it. And the question is, what is the alternative? How do you put a resilience lens over the way we're behaving in the world today? Is there an alternative paradigm to continued growth? Well, I offer this tentative, provocative, shepherded self-organization for resilience of human well-being as the alternative to continued growth. And I'm still struggling with the word here, shepherded, and I'll tell you why, but I'll welcome suggestions. Guided self-organization, which is an international research group now, actually began here in Australia. The first international workshop in 2008 was organized by Mikhail Prokopenko, and those were the sponsors. and it has now had several other meetings, and it's a really interesting development and idea. But the formal definition of guided self-organization remains an elusive task, as Prokopenko says. There's a book out just this year in which there's a chapter on the guided self-organization that says that actually targeted and guided are essentially identical terms. One could guide, for example, a dynamical system by restricting its flow to a certain region and allow for others. But all said and done, when they've finished their discussion, the theme of guided self-organization is this balance between purposeful design and self-organization. Purposeful design from a resilience perspective is too much about choosing where to go. In a resilience approach, the objective is not choosing where to go, but rather where not to go, such as not crossing planetary boundaries. The challenge in the Anthropocene is to achieve resilience of human well-being in the face of this looming food, water, energy nexus. And therefore, I suggest shepherded self-organization, shepherding from behind and below to avoid unacceptable trajectories, but so as to enable the full amount of self-organization amongst the set of acceptable trajectories. That would offer hope to begin with, as opposed to those who deny evolution, because there is some hope in all of this. But it also enables real innovation and evolution, not just in a chosen set if you pick the perfect future. And it allows biological evolution to continue, and it avoids catastrophic outcomes for humans. So that's my final statement, is that rather than aiming for impossible growth targets with an inevitable catastrophe, there is the option, through shepherding the self-organizing processes in social ecological systems, to enhance our capacity to remain within a set of acceptable trajectories. And this functions from the local scale, through the scale of cities, through the scale of catchment management authorities, through nations to regions, up to the globe, at all scales. I think that that is an alternative to economic sustained growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for a very thought-provoking talk. Questions and comments, please. Suzanne. It's coming.
Brian, first of all, very thought-provoking and a very fitting end to a fantastic day. I'd like you to go a little further from that statement up there and tease out some examples for us to make it more tangible.
I was hoping no one would ask that. I understand where you're coming from, Suzanne. And what, for example, the things that these companies that are doing that I've been working with, they said we would like to put a resilience lens over what we're doing now and see how that would change what we're doing. And so, for example, what it's started for them to do is to get rid of things like, what's it called, in-time marketing, just-in-time marketing, getting rid of redundancies. They've changed their view of what efficiency is, because often getting rid of a redundancy is not getting rid of duplicate things, it's getting rid of different ways of doing the same thing, importantly, and therefore getting rid of functional diversity. So all of these things begin to take place in it. But I think what it says is that it's going to call for a fundamental change in many of the things which we base our system on, transformational change. We can't keep having the same systems of governance. We can't keep actually having the same systems of economics. There is a whole developing school of different economics around the world, from evolutionary economics to non-growth economics, and I'm not an economist, but there are enough people in the economics field to say we cannot keep going with neoclassical economics as it is now. We don't want to chuck out the notion of markets, and we have to keep that. But the way economics is being done now is inevitably going to lead us into a disaster. I'm sure many of you have heard of Piketty and his latest book, It's the same kind of built-in structure that the economic system is forcing us to go along. So I don't have an immediate answer. If we have a lot of time, I could go into more detail with you. But I do think there are things that we can tangibly start to do, but we need to identify the things which we have to, first of all, transform in the processes that we're doing. Sometimes the way in which we handle the governance of resource management in this country that I've been involved in, we don't have distributed governance. We don't allow things to be made at different levels, up and down. We should have that. And that would just require a change in the way our governance system operates. So I think there's a number of things which we could start implementing that would allow self-organization within acceptable ways without identifying the perfect future, but would help us to have the capacity to avoid dangerous thresholds.
We have a question up the back.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful talk, and I hope, or I wish that a couple of people up in Parliament Hill could actually listen to that talk. But where do you think, if we have this shepherded self-organization, how do you think are humans able to sort of fit in the me and the I and the elbowing, and a lot of that has been sort of characteristic of essentially Western capitalism, at least how I see it, is that there's a lot of me and I and not a lot of what can we do for each other? Do you think that embedded in what you suggest is sort of a moving away from that? Or how do you think that contradicts with essentially that humans are it's about me when it comes down to, to the essential things?
Now, I think you've hit on a very important point, and it has to do with power. And there's a whole developing area of interest now about how do you analyze and define the role of power in organizations. And it turns out that a lot of power is based on the need for self-recognition and for being understood. Being able to hand out largesse is actually a big thing about recognizing me, me, me. And it's about power and your identity. Wilkinson, you might have read his book with Kate Pickett on the tipping, the balance, I always forget the name of it, but Wilkinson and Pickett wrote a very interesting book. He was out here recently at an economics meeting, and at dinner that night he was saying his interest now is in the role of power. And what he was saying is that avarice or greed, which seems to drive things, is actually not the basic cause of why we're going wrong. The avarice is the index of power. And if we could simply change that index, so instead of saying to someone, I admire you because you're rich, if you said, I really admire you because you're looking after your land, or some such thing, that person would recognize eventually that what I'm being, the me, 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 is going to be recognized for doing something that's going to be sustainable instead of for doing something that isn't. But it's to do with power and recognition. I'm not a social scientist, but in talking to social scientists, it's very much bound up in that.
Thank you very much. Very quick question, very quick, because we're running way behind and some of us have other things to go to.
Just to add a point, Ross McFedrin, University of Sydney, in corroboration of what you're saying about why the present system is broken, a couple of years ago, Germany sponsored a project to build photovoltaic plants in the Sahara and pipe the electricity back into Europe. Sounds very good, but it collapsed due to organisational disputes. So that's the sort of thing we should be doing, and the sort of thing that's not working now.
Absolutely. There are many of those identified by big companies as well.
On that note, I think we should thank Brian for a very stimulating talk.